Good afternoon and welcome to Parks and Recreation Ontario's Virtual Educational Forum 2020. Delighted to have you with us today, and if you would like to say hello to your fellow delegates, please use the chat box and you can introduce yourself and perhaps where you're from. This session is being recorded. Please use the drop down that says to all panelists and all attendees so that everyone can see who you are. And before we start, we would like to, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, recognize that our work takes place on traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples who have inhabited this territory since the beginning. We're grateful for this opportunity to work on this land and are mindful of broken covenants and strive to make this right with each other and with the land. Greetings and welcome to Parks and Recreation Ontario's Educational Forum. My name is Marion Price. I'm delighted to be with you today. I am the Director of Quality Assurance and Professional Development for Parks and Recreation Ontario, and we're pleased to provide today's session, which is a Canadian Parks and Recreation Association update, as well as a session on retaining girls in sport, recreation, and physical activity. Before we do that, however, let's just take a look at our Zoom controls. If this is the first time you're with us, you can use the chat room to say hello to your fellow delegates, as well as to identify if you are having any technical issues. Our wonderful technical team, Donna, will be happy to assist you. If in fact you have questions, and we hope there will be lots of questions because this is a very interesting topic today, please use the question and answer box, and we will address those questions at the end of the presentation. If in fact you would like to change how you view the presentation on your screen, you can make the presenter or the PowerPoint larger by just pulling the bar in between the presenter's picture as well as the PowerPoint presentation. And we would be remiss if we did not thank our title sponsor for the Educational Forum, Perfect Mind. Perfect Mind is a recreation registration software, Canadian company out of British Columbia that has long been a supporter of Parks and Recreation services across the country, as well as Parks and Recreation Ontario being a sponsor for our events, specifically our Educational Forum. So thank you to Perfect Mind. Now let's move on to our session today. We have an update from CJ Noble, who is the Chief Executive Officer with with the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association.
Good afternoon. On behalf of CPRA, thank you for joining us at this session on the retention of women and girls in sport. Before the session, I wanted to take a few minutes to give you a brief update on the CPRA work that's taken place through this very challenging year. CPRA, as you know, is the national voice for municipal parks and recreation in Canada. We have 13 members, each from every provincial and territorial parks and recreation association in Canada, including PRO, who's a steadfast supporter of CPRA. Our national office is in Ottawa, and we're supported by a 13-member board of directors, including Howie Dayton from Toronto. We also have a number of task groups, including one that's dedicated to infrastructure and facilities, and another one dedicated to parks. We began 2020 with all sorts of great plans for the year ahead. But, like all organizations, we had to reimagine our role. How could we, CPRA, provide national support to the sector through COVID-19 in an efficient way, in an effective way, and not duplicating support that was already being provided by the government or other organizations? We heard loud and clear that the sector wanted to learn from each other across the country about best practices on COVID-19 recovery. And so we held a 6-part COVID-19 webinar series. Over 1,200 individuals participated in the live webinars, and many others have viewed the recorded version. I invite you to check out our website to see all 6. One was on the reopening of parks and trails, another on the reopening of aquatic facilities, one on reopening playgrounds and sports fields, one on reopening multi-sport facilities, another one on reopening arenas, and finally, communicating the power and possibilities of parks and recreation. CPRA also knew that each province, territory, and municipality were experiencing COVID differently. And CPRA knew that we needed to harness the knowledge across the country in order to provide the right support. We created a national COVID-19 task group, which was a collection of professionals, practitioners, experts, and academics that guided us through the challenge. We also created a big cities roundtable where the 8 largest populated cities could come together and share and learn on COVID-19 response. We had weekly calls with our PT members to ensure that they were also exposed and experiencing how other municipalities were dealing with COVID-19. And all of this allowed us to provide the tools and the support to the sector accordingly. Our voice for the sector to the federal government was never so important as it was during COVID-19. We worked tirelessly to ensure that the federal government understood the impact of the pandemic on the parks and recreation sector. We spoke to ministers, MPs, senators, political staff, government officials, and we also submitted a pre-budget submission to the Finance Committee. We stuck to 2 evolving requests. One was that the federal government created a community sport and recreation recovery fund. And second, that the federal government delivered a direct to municipality infrastructure funding program specifically for parks and recreation. We've seen a number of programs and initiatives that have been announced by the government in support of these asks, but we continue to advocate. Prior to COVID-19, CPRA was beginning to build an online community for parks and recreation, and COVID amplified this need. In July of 2020, we were pleased to launch The Bench. The Bench is an online community hub that includes discussion groups, professional development, a resource library, information on funding opportunities, events, and jobs. It began with a focus on COVID-19, but has expanded to be much more than that now. Please join us and the other 1,000 users on The Bench. Before COVID, CPRA had just completed its 3-year Green Jobs in Green Spaces program, where with the federal government, we provided wage subsidies to over 1,400 youth and delivered $5.1 million in funding to communities. We also were and continue to deliver a 3-year initiative on girls and women in sport, with a focus on their participation and retention in recreation sport. We've developed and disseminated tools, held workshops, focused high-five training sessions, and we're having a community funding program. The current one, the applications are due on December 11th. We're also pursuing additional funding, including another wage subsidy program and funding to support the development of pandemic-resilient guidelines for recreation facilities. 2020 also brought a call to all Canadians to address the issue of systemic racism. CPRA for the past few years has been on a journey to understand truth and reconciliation. And now, this summer, we participated in a systemic racism workshop, and we're preparing to participate in an implicit bias training. This understanding will help CPRA provide tools for communities to better address systemic racism. We're also creating a national space for professionals who are Black or people of color and work in the parks and recreation sector. In between these priorities, CPRA continued its important and ongoing initiatives, including professional development, awards, bursaries, quarterly webinars, and we signed MOUs with NRPA and the Canadian Parks Council. Now it's time to reflect on how the framework for recreation and parks for all guided our sector through this crisis. What are the gaps? What are the opportunities for improvement? Thank you again for your ongoing support of CPRA. Please enjoy this session and the remainder of the Pro Virtual Conference. Thank you.
And that was our Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. And so now we would like to pass the torch over to a member of the Educational Forum Committee, and it is Michelle Kandari. And Michelle is going to introduce today's session and our speakers for today. So Michelle will take you through the next portion of the program. Thanks, Michelle.
Perfect. Thank you, Marion. So our two presenters that will be speaking to you for the next hour are Vanessa Wallace and Gabby Estrada. So Vanessa will speak to us first. Vanessa is an employee of the Canadian Women in Sport. She supports the development and execution of the organization's core programs, which are designed to advance gender equity in sport and physical activity. Vanessa's career interest in sport as a means of social justice started when she became an ambassador for You Can Play, leading workshops for youth on how to identify and address homophobia in sport. Vanessa passes along her knowledge from playing basketball at U of T, teaching life skills through sport at MLSE Launchpad. Gabby Estrada is from Scarborough and the proud daughter of immigrant parents from Guatemala. She is the program director of Fast and Female. She's a master's student conducting research on racialized women's experiences in movement-based opportunities and a community sport programmer. Gabby is incredibly passionate and a strong advocate for girls and women in sport, physical activity, and recreation. So Gabby and I will now leave you with Vanessa, and she will get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Michelle, for that generous introduction. We are really pleased to be here today on behalf of Canadian Women in Sport and also in partnership with the Canadian Parks and Rec Association. So grateful to be speaking to you about this topic, which is really closely tied to the mandate of Canadian Women in Sport by improving the experience of girls in recreational sport and really increasing their longevity and participation. So Gabby, you can head to the next slide. I won't go too in depth here because CJ's video really covered a lot of this, but I will explain, the origins of these workshops and CPRA's commitment to advancing gender equity and how they aim to do that. So the workshop you're attending today is virtual, but the goal is to increase, knowledge and build capacity in program deliverers to retain girls in recreational sport. So we can move on to the next. Great. The intention for these workshops were to be delivered in person and have us all join together and share ideas in that way. But unfortunately, due to COVID, that isn't possible. But maybe soon in the future, we will be sharing the resources with you later on about the community grant available that CJ touched on in the video, and in addition to all of the great content you'll receive. Next slide, Gabby. So you are likely familiar with this document. This framework was created in 2015, I believe. But today's workshop is really going to be addressing goals 1, 2, 4, and 5. So goal 4 of goal 1 of active living. So through fostering active living through recreation. Goal 2, increasing inclusion and access to recreation for populations that face constraints to participation. So those barriers that we'll really be addressing in the first and second portion of the workshop. Building supportive environments will come along towards the end. So ensuring that the provisions of support and physical and social space that are encouraged for participations in recreation are strong and caring. And then lastly, ensuring the continued growth and sustainability of the recreational field, so building capacity. With that, I'll be in the chat. I'll be providing links and resources as Gabby delivers, and I'll be supporting and fielding questions. But you won't see me for a while. I'm still around. And with that, I pass the torch to Gabby.
Thanks so much, Vanessa and Michelle and Marion, for the introduction and everything. And hi to everyone out there. I'm really excited to be here today on behalf of Canadian Women in Sport and present this presentation to you all. So just before we begin, a quick reminder that you can find numerous resources, events, and other information on Canadian Women in Sport and their services by visiting their website. So it's listed here. It's www.womeninsport.ca. And you can also find them on social media. They have Facebook, Twitter, and have recently joined the world of Instagram, which I was personally very excited about. And their Instagram and Twitter handles are at Women in Sport CA. So a bit of an agenda of what we'll be going over for the next approximate hour. Firstly, we'll be covering a variety of different materials. We want to start with a bit of a welcome and introductions, just to get to know a little of you that are on the call today, really through your name. So we'll go over that. We're going to go into setting the context and covering some key terms and trends that are going to act as the foundation of your knowledge of gender equity, both in sport and recreation and the broader context for life. We're going to talk about influential factors on participation in physical activity, talk about some recent reports that Canadian Women in Sport has come up with, and then really being able to finish with the design for girls and women in terms of any programming and key considerations. So we want to make sure we're covering and kind of giving you a really good foundation and overview of what to consider. As Vanessa mentioned, she's going to be here monitoring the chat. So if you do have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to pop them into the chat. And then if it needs my attention, it'll be brought to me as well. So let's start with getting to know one another. I'm sure many of you have been in multiple video calls and potentially Zoom calls. So if you haven't done so yet, we're absolutely encouraging you to rename yourself, which you can do by just going over in the participant tab. You should be able to see your own name and then going to the end of your name to click more and then rename. And so you'll be able to rename yourself. And we're encouraging you all to put your first name, your personal pronouns, and then the community, city, region that you're from. So here's an example of what I would do today. Mine's a little different just so that you can identify me as being a presenter. I put Canadian Women in Sport at the end of mine. So what we're going to do to start off, beyond getting familiar with those of you that are in the chat, is put up a poll to get to know you all a little better. So a poll should have just popped up. It's asking if you were inspired to be physically active or play sports growing up by a family member, professional athlete, community member, educator, or if you weren't involved in physical activity growing up. So just wanted to get a bit of a sense of who we have in the room and your own experiences. So I will give it another few seconds. And I'm just gonna end the polling now if anyone wants to just squeeze their way in. And then I'm going to share the results. So most of you were inspired by a family member. A few of you by a professional athlete, a community member, an educator, and then a few of you that weren't involved in physical activity. And that is totally okay. So now we have another poll. Curious as to your motivation. So I'm going to launch this one. So if you are motivated to improve physical activity by the community of people that you serve, your team, the people you work with, the positive impact sport and physical activity has had on your own life, and if there's any other reasons. So I will leave that up for another few seconds. Perfect. Last 5, 2, and 1. Okay, and so an overwhelming majority of you all are motivated to improve physical activity by the own positive impact that it's had on your life. A few of you are motivated by your team and the people you work with and by the community of people that you serve. That's excellent. Sorry, let me just share those results. So there they are. Thank you all for participating. I'm just going to stop sharing them. And let's go over our workshop objectives. So now that we have gotten to know each other a little more, just going over why we're all here today. So the Retaining Girls in Sport, Recreation, and Physical Activity workshop is today is going to be a 60-minute workshop that combines foundational concepts with practical application to empower program leaders to design the programs that will enhance girls' engagement and extend their participation in recreational sport. So really, this is an opportunity for us to, let's talk about some knowledge and experiences, key considerations. We want to understand the influences on girls' participation, things that as programmers and any other supporting staff we should be aware of, and then looking at holistically designing programs as well, which is taking a bit of a different approach than some of us may be used to, but going in a much more positive direction. So let's set the context. The first thing we're going to start with is talking about equality versus equity. So many of you may have heard the terminology being thrown around a lot, especially lately. And so they're fairly common terms and they're often mistaken as interchangeable. Although they're both positive in what they're attempting to do, we can see how there's a large difference in what equality does versus what equity does. So as an organization with the mission of advancing gender equity, Canadian Women in Sport is often clarifying the difference between the two terms. So we can see here on the slide, the bicycle metaphor. Equality is all about giving everybody the same tools and resources. So it's the same starting line. And you can see here by the different individuals that the bicycle that's shown in this example really only benefits one of the 4 individuals. Whereas equity is about ensuring fair access for all based on their needs. So it's a focus on getting people to the finish line. So it's really being able to adjust and accommodate based on your targeted demographic, based on the individual and their own needs. Equity acknowledges and encourages us to address the many contributing factors that impact our starting line. And so gender equity is the process of allocating resources, programs, and decisions making fairly to both men and women, and then addressing any imbalances in the benefits available to men and women or boys and girls and people of diverse genders. Another key concept, and this is personally one of my favorites, is the term intersectionality. So again, this might be a term that you may have heard a lot recently. It's becoming more common in the recent years. It's actually a term that was developed in 1989 and coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It started off as a legal term that Crenshaw used to make a case around the way the legal system was discriminating certain characteristics of individuals, specifically Black women. And so intersectionality is ultimately being able to identify that everyone has different social identities and that the way they intersect with one another can greatly impact what their experiences are in their day-to-day lives. And if we're looking in the sport and recreation world, is how they might experience or access sport and recreation. So it considers all the layers of an individual's identity. And you might see things like age, sexual orientation, race, ability, gender and gender identity, ethnicity, class, citizenship. There's so many layers that make us who we are. And so it's really being able to move away from a more homogenous approach and a one-size-fits-all approach. And in this aspect, we're really talking about gender plus. We are talking about girls and women, so gender is one of the social identities and is the social identity that's really at the core and focus of what Canadian Women in Sport does and what we're talking about today. But taking a gender plus approach is being able to acknowledge and be aware that there are other considerations that could impact your participants and those around you, and potentially yourselves as well, taking a moment to reflect of your own intersectionality and your own social identities. So we're just going to take a quick second to review the long-term development model. Many of you may already be well-versed in the model. So taking a quick look here, we can see that it's a multi-stage training, competition, and recovery pathway in sport. starts from an active start to being active for life. And then we have obviously the different sections of being like the training to train to compete, train to win, depending on an individual's sport and recreation involvement. It does touch on some of the barriers to girls and young women's sport and physical activity experience. And so we obviously want to be able to put a bit of a gender lens on it. Again, gender plus, and consider different strategies for gender neutrality versus considerations based on socialized differences. So what I'm going to do now is we have more of a bit of a quiz. It's going to come up as a poll and looking at the current Canadian landscape. What we want to know is what you think the percentage of Canadian girls not participating in any type of sport or physical activity is. So feel free to guess, take a guess, choose one of them. Don't worry if it's wrong. I will give you the right answer, I promise. Excellent. I'm going to give it a few more seconds. And last 5. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So 62% is the most popular result. It's actually 51%, which in this case, it's a little better that we all thought it was higher and it's actually lower. But unfortunately, it is 51%. So let's kind of get to know a little more about why and why not. So these are a couple of interesting factors. The data from both the multiple choice and this table are from Canadian Women in Sports Rally Report. So if anyone hasn't seen it as of yet, it was released this year. It's a 2020 report. It's the newest report that explores the current Canadian trends in sport participation with a specific focus on the targeted groups of girls ages 6 to 18. And it was done in partnership with Canadian Tire Jumpstart. So overall, the report shows that sport participation levels for Canadian girls are still much lower than boys. Among girls who have participated in sport, there is a dramatic dropout rate observed with 1 in 3 girls dropping out of sport by late adolescence. Whereas if you look at boys in comparison between the ages of 16 to 18, it's only 1 in 10. So across the board, we can see that boys and girls are not doing too well. However, girls are greatly much more higher impacted, and we see a larger dropout rate. And in that, the sport participation rates for Canadian girls decline steadily from childhood to adolescence, with as many as 62% of girls not playing sport at all. However, if that girl has a disability or her family earns less than $50,000 annually, those odds are even greater. And this is why it is really important to take an intersectional approach. And I'm going to do my best to really bring it back to intersectionality throughout this presentation. Is although we're focusing on gender in these conversations, is taking that gender plus approach allows us to be more conscious and aware and understanding of other considerations when we are working on programming opportunities for girls in sport and recreation. And so what this table ends up actually showing us is why we have to consider more than program execution when looking to extend girls' time in sport and physical activity. So while not all of these factors are within our sphere of influence as program leaders or administrators, what barriers can we lessen if not eliminate? So I'm going to pop up another poll to see what you think here. So here I'd like to know what you think the percentage of girls reporting the quality of program was a barrier to their participation. So I'll give it a few seconds. And again, like this is just a learning opportunity. I'm not marking you on any of your answers by any means. So I'll give it another 5. And I'm going to end the poll there and share the results. Okay, so 33% was the most popular response. So it actually is 43%, unfortunately. So let me just go to the next slide. So 43% of adolescent girls said the quality of sport was a barrier. And so that's nearly half of the girls surveyed that said that that was a barrier to them. And it's a barrier in their participation and continuation in sport. And so on this slide, you can also see the various reasons the quality of a program can be diminished. And fortunately, a lot of these reasons are within our control. So not being appropriately designed, quality coaching, positive role models, poor overall experiences, and that sport may be too competitive. So we're going to take a second now to talk about the influential factors on sport participation and how it impacts girls. So this here is our socio-ecological model. And so as we know, girls experience barriers to sport at a number of junctures. So the socio-ecological model is a helpful way to look at the various layers of influence. And it includes 4 spheres: interpersonal, intrapersonal, environmental, policy, and societal. And so I think, again, if we take also an intersectional approach, is we're acknowledging that there are so many factors at play when it comes to a girl's participation in sport, physical activity, and recreation. And this is just a good way to think about some of the things that directly might impact them. So if we look at the interpersonal sphere to start with, and so that's the one that's closest to the sport and physical activity participation, that can be anything a girl may think or feel that prevents them from participating in sport. So this can be a result from internalized stereotypes and gender stereotypes. So for example, believing that a specific sport is too rough for girls, or that she'll be perceived to have a specific sexual preference if she likes sports, or that she doesn't want to be seen as disruptive by pointing out a barrier to her participation in sport. Gender stereotypes are a very big one. In case you may not have been aware of this, but sport was built on a very strong male foundation. And so now as we saw girls starting to come into the sports system, there is still resistance to their barriers because of their participation, because of the historical way that sport had been built. When we look beyond the interpersonal and we look at the interpersonal, we have to also consider the close relationships that influence a girl's understanding of the role of sport in their life. So do they have emotional or economic support of their family? We have to also can consider their friends, what is happening surrounding them and those that influence the most that could pose a barrier to their participation. And then if we look at the environmental sphere, we have to consider different access points to sport, literally and figuratively. So are there even programs available to her? Is there a sport or recreation girls only opportunity? Are they of high quality? Are there other girls in the program? Are there appropriate cultural measures in place for a Muslim girl, for example, to participate? And then in addition to the right equipment and the space, are the role models present in the coaching staff and program administrators? And we're going to get into role models a little more, but thinking about, the environment of the sport and recreation activity. And then lastly, there's the policy related sphere. And so what that considers is the external structures that affect the community's access to quality sport programming. So for example, is there adequate funding for the sport and recreation opportunity? Is there a program held at a time that girls can attend? Are there streams for girls to progress as athletes? So we can see here that realistically, the way that the ecological model works is that all these different spheres really impact each other. And then when you layer intersectionality on top of that, there are so many considerations that need to be put into place and understandings on why a girl may or may not participate in a sport or recreation opportunity. So it's a lot. We're not here to solve all the world's problems in one shot, but definitely something that is really important to be aware of as you progress forward in any program and like opportunity planning. So we also want to look at the top reasons that girls give for leaving and staying in sport and recreation. So factors that have been reported that limit girls and young women's experiences include time commitment. Time is a very popular one. Time is actually always a barrier that I like to talk about, love and hate to talk about, because time as a concept, we can understand that, time can mean many different things to many different people. And I think in my case, as well as I always like to take an intersectional approach of what time means. And is it time because of the time that the program is running? Is it time because of the length of time of the program? Is it time because of potentially the access that the girl might have because they have other considerations? So time is an all-in-one covering factor that could limit girls, but different ways to think about time. The other one is financial barriers. So that could be things like the cost of the program or the cost of added equipment pieces beyond the program. So there could be an initial cost to access the program, but then what are the other things that might cost to be able to participate? So obviously if we're looking in a more sport focused opportunity like hockey, for example, as we understand that there's most likely going to be a cost to participate, but then there's the cost of all the equipment as well. Injuries are also one that's commonly reported. So whether it's the fear of injury or having a past injury, that could limit a girl's participation. And then no more enjoyment is what has happened that maybe has taken the enjoyment out of what the girl used to have. And this could also be linked to the level of competition or any coaches or programmers that may impact their enjoyment. So then looking on the flip side is what factors enhance girls and young women's experiences. So positive group dynamics is a very big one. It's all about social belonging as well, is ensuring that girls and those that participate alongside them really feel welcomed and safe in the environment, that it's something that they want to be a part of. Trying hard is something as well. So the opportunity to give them an opportunity to try a little, something a little more competitive, which I can also hear how that might be something that has been identified as something that could restrict girls, but they do want the opportunity to try. And then positive coaching. So again, making sure that those that are either your programmers or your coaches, your lead facilitators, are there to create that environment where the girls can thrive, where they can build relationships and so forth. So now we're going to move into designing for girls and women. So we've talked about key considerations, looking at the current landscape of girls and women in sport, physical activity and recreation, what's limiting them and what's encouraging them. So then what do you need to be made aware of when it comes to actually designing programs? So here are a few of the considerations. We're going to go more in depth into some of them. So we know why girls leave sports and what motivates them, but let's look at evidence-based solutions that you can apply to support ongoing participation and retention. So the 4 that we've narrowed them down to are consult, build supportive environments, foster fun, and prevent injuries. And so we want to dig into these issues. So what are the experiences of girls and women? And then moving forward is understanding what action is necessary and what promising practices exist. Looking at consult, you want to make sure you're consulting, and we're going to go into this in a second, your stakeholder organizations, an organization that specializes in this area. So for example, Canadian Women in Sport is a great place to start, but your consultation should not be limited to the issues of gender equity. So as mentioned, girls in Canada have many intersecting identities that would benefit from more information going into your program planning. So are you offering, for example, adaptive programming for women or youth who have experienced violence, girls leadership programming? Is this a need in your community, but you are not an expert, or do you not have lived experience in this area? So being able to look to an organization to guide you through this process, and also being aware of who is involved in the design process. Building supportive environments, so through positive coaching that prioritizes social connection, being able to foster fun. So with each interaction and activity, fun should be a primary goal. And then preventing injuries. So we're going to get into some of the common injuries that sideline girls from sport, and then how to equip your program deliverers to prevent them. So let's start with consulting. This is my absolute favorite. Is you want to be able to go into this without necessarily making too many assumptions. So there are a multitude of individuals that you consult when it comes to program design and delivery. And consultation is the key to offering programs that are appropriate and will benefit your community. So again, going back to some of the earlier points, is what we're talking about here is a great base foundation, but being able to understand who is actually in your community, who is actually going to participate, your coaches, your staff, and the girls, most importantly, is so key in building out programs. And there's different ways that you can do that. But ultimately, making a program without being aware of who would be able to participate or other considerations that you may not be aware of does put you in a bit of an awkward position. But if you're able to have the opportunity to actually see who's in your community and talk to your participants, talk to your staff and other organizations, does go a very long way. So this can mean anything from offering programs that girls are interested. So understanding, is this something that they're still interested in? In my role at Fast and Female, we used to have a lot of yoga in our programs. We quickly learned that girls, at least the girls we were working in, were no longer interested in yoga. And so we moved into boxing and Zumba, and found that that's something that they wanted to see more and really enjoyed. Also understanding why participation rates may be dropping, or finding out how to layer in specific education into a sport or physical activity is important. So, also being able to hear from the community and the girls understands kind of what they're into. I'm very fortunate to be able to still coach in my community. And so, and at different levels and ages, and also have a younger sister. So I'm always kind of listening in to understand, okay, what are the cool kids into right now? Is it Snapchat? Is it TikTok? What's your favorite way to move? A lot of people enjoy dances right now. So just being aware of that. Also, effective consultation requires thoughtful research and in most cases, partnerships. So if you're looking to improve or develop new programs, also consulting stakeholders of your program, or having a breadth of experience with your target audience, like mentioned. So especially if you're looking at a program that's specific to us, targeted to a specific demographic. So if you're looking at building a program for newcomer girls and women, ideally you'd want to consider consulting a settlement agency and then being able to talk to women and girls. Now, another big piece of this is diversity and representation. So ensuring that there's a diverse range of voices and experiences in the groups you consult. And similar to what I just mentioned is representation as well. If you're creating a program for newcomers and everyone that is creating the program was born in Canada and has no experience or understanding or lived experience of newcomers, then you're making assumptions, and that can be really dangerous. So you want to avoid going down that path and making sure that you have representation and diverse voices to be able to support your planning. Another few things to consider is surveying prospective program participants from different socioeconomic groups, those from different ability levels, and then always keeping in mind, again, the intersecting identities of those that you were planning for, and ensuring you consult a representative group. So I'm being able to build supportive environments, and when considering key motivations to girls' key motivations to participation, you want to create a social and emotionally safe space for your participants and staff. That is absolutely a priority. If someone does not feel safe in your space, whether they're a girl or a staff, it's definitely taking a moment to reflect why and figure out what are those next action steps to removing that barrier. So safe environment is not limited to physical space and emergency procedures. Obviously, something very important to consider. But you also want to look at these three factors. So physical environment, social environment, and physical and mental engagement. Physical and mental health are all interrelated. They all work together. And so all three pieces have a relationship with one another. And without consideration for one of these aspects, you cannot achieve a safe and supportive program environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to go more in depth into this next. So building supportive environments. So you can see here girls and boys. So what you want to understand is your participants' motivations to be in programs, and how that's, again, key to fueling their desire to play and key to retaining them in your program. So there's key distinctions and what may lead a positive outcome for girls and boys. And this is just what's commonly seen in the research and in the findings. Again, knowing your target audience and understand this could vary, but this is what we've seen increasingly in reports and data. So for many boy participants, performance enhances their social positions, whereas for girls, social acceptance enhances individual and group performance. So girls might question, am I accepted and valued for who I am? And I think that's also just being aware of our societal and cultural norms and what's commonly seen right now in the media, in social media. We're trying to move from making a girl feel that they are not enough, because we have enough of that in the media, and trying to push girls and women to be a certain way and act a certain way. So we want to be able to make them feel like they are accepted and valued for who they are, because when they feel accepted, girls feel like they have the security to try without fear of social repercussion from making mistakes or failing. Especially in a recreational environment, there's obviously opportunities to get more competitive in recreation, but what we're ultimately trying to do is engage them in the programs. So efforts then lead to improved performance, which fuels even more effort, but we can't forget the root of social connections. And this is why managing group dynamics is so important for all programs and opportunities. And again, this actually comes from a really great tool, which I'm sure Vanessa will share afterwards. It's our She Belongs, or Canadian Women in Sports She Belongs tool that was also released this year, and has some great takeaways that we are touching on here as well. So then, in also building supportive environments, we have to go beyond the X's and O's of programs. So obviously, with a program, you're thinking of timing, equipment needs, what are the activities, when is it happening, where, how many participants do you have capacity for, how many coaches. But again, going back to what the environment actually looks like around being safe and welcoming and inclusive as well. We really want to emphasize the values of sport, prioritizing social connections, and exposing girls to role models. We're going to go through role models a little more in a bit. But ultimately what that does is leads to the empowerment of girls in and outside of sport. Sport and recreation are incredibly valuable. And I think it's safe to say that most of you on the call recognize that there's so many incredible transferable life skills and experiences that come out of it. For me, sport and recreation led for what I wanted to do in my career and in school. I did not even think of sport and recreation as a potential career opportunity. I participated in sport myself growing up. My dad played baseball in Guatemala. I played baseball. I hated it. So I went into ballet, swimming, found soccer. And I went to do my undergraduate in anthropology and linguistics, but through sport, I found that there were so many incredible things that could come out of it. And it really gave me, a better experience in school, but led to me wanting to discover more and building better opportunities. And so we want to be able to create that empowerment through sport and recognize that what we do in our programs, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, go so much more beyond that if we're really able to build these environments and be able to equip the girls, the coaches, the programmers with these skills to make lifelong impact. So when we think for the long term, when we think back to the long-term athlete development model, and we think about being active for life, that isn't just about being active for life and what it does to their physical health, but there's so many ways that it impacts their mental health, their social health, their emotional health, just so many great positives if we're able to build that environment. And so it's also important to acknowledge that in the same way a girl's sport and physical activity experience can be greatly influenced by factors at the different sociological levels of their life, everyone has a role to play in ensuring an environment that is supportive. Organizational leads, sport administrators, program deliverers, we all play, even if it feels like a small role, the impact can go a very, very long way. So I want you to take a moment to reflect on your team or staff culture. And do you feel like it meets these standards? Is it safe and welcoming? Does it encourage girls? Does it provide a positive experience? Does it expose girls to strong and powerful female role models or women role models, better said? And does it empower girls to strive for their full and equal position in sport and society? The other thing, like I've mentioned, is talking about role models. I'm a big fan of role models and the idea that you can't be what you can't see. And we do have a lot of incredible groundbreakers, barrier breakers who are paving the way for girls and women. We're fortunate to see a lot more of them in the media than we normally would. But this is really something that's important in all aspects and areas of sport, recreation, and just our day-to-day life. Supportive environments cannot exist without visible role models and champions of gender equity. And so to reap the full benefits of role models, they must be able to consciously practice healthy habits and adopt positive attitudes that participants can learn from. So representation is necessary so all girls have a role model that they can look up to. So if we take a look at how to include and leverage role models to creating a safe and empowering environment, we can recognize that there are role models that the girls already have in their lives, the opportunity to watch, discuss, and celebrate athletes in the media, women athletes, inviting women coaches, mentors, and community leaders in, and then even being able to reference or name the drill after an athlete or a team. One thing that I've seen a lot lately, which is great, is in some of the programs I'm a part of, if we play Simon Says, we call it Simone Says, and we were referring to Simone Biles. I think also when we talk about role models, we have to go back to that representation piece is, we're still seeing predominantly white role models, and we also want to be able to increase that representation there, especially if our targeted demographic includes diverse girls and participants that come from racialized and other equity-seeking groups, is you also want to be able to have them see themselves there. It makes a world of a difference. It gives them the confidence. It makes them feel like they are able to attain that. I, growing up, never had any coaches that were women, never saw women in a lot of the leadership roles that I had surrounding me. And so to be able to see that changing now, and then to be able to be that for others is probably one of the greatest honors of my life. And I think if it's something to also understand that you all have an opportunity to be role models for your participants, and then be able to also elevate women close to you, women identifying individuals, to be role models for others as well. There are also many more suggestions like these that you can find in the She Belongs resource that I had mentioned earlier. So fostering fun. Okay, so we want to talk about fun. So this is how girls define fun. They define it as positive group dynamics, trying hard, and positive coaching. So when surveyed, they noted that these three were the three big indicators of a fun experience. So we want to take a moment to think about, what does this actually look like in practice? So let's start with positive team dynamics. So why is it critical to build positive team dynamics on a team? So ultimately, what we're looking to do is enhance girls' performance, addressing the social pressures that lead girls to drop out of sport at twice the rate of boys, and then being able to prepare coaches to recognize and disrupt the signs of girls' disengagement from sport. So there are many ways to infuse social connection into a sport program. We recommend things like adding unstructured time and offering informal activities that are participant driven. So even if it's, for example, allocating that the first 10 minutes of a program is just free play, where they're able to choose different activities and just go nuts, have fun, that opportunity really can go a long way for some of your participants. You could also allow them to do a warm up to their favorite music. Even at the end, giving them an opportunity to work on a skill of their choosing after you've gone through your program. And what this actually ends up doing is it allows girls to collaborate, and for you as a leader to learn more about their likes and dislikes. Structured programs are great. I'm someone who tries to plan out exactly what the 60 minutes of my program is going to look like. And it is almost a guarantee that it never ends up being exactly what I had planned. But if I know leaving that the girls had an opportunity to do what they may have liked, have fun, and walk away with smiles and having a good time, to me, that's much more valuable than having stuck exactly to every single detail of the schedule. To be truly effective, however, these values must be part of a greater organizational attitude to prioritize relationships over outcomes, and they are a need. Being able, again, look at what is the core focus of what this program is. And ultimately, it should be about having the participants enjoy themselves, and then finding those ways to implement that and infuse that in what you're already doing. So trying hard. So like most people, girls find satisfaction in giving their best effort. So referring back to those intrinsic motivators, this does require that a program leader first creates an environment where girls feel comfortable to show vulnerability by trying hard. And an environment where they still, again, going back to the safeties, they feel safe and comfortable and able to do so. So what can get in the way of trying new things, learning from experiences, and getting to compete is the potential of making a mistake and jeopardizing that social standing. So to combat this, girls must have the fundamentals down so they can build more complex skills on top of that foundation. So we encourage the use of goal setting, for example, to be able to enable girls to reframe risk-taking as a necessary means to improvement. So let them know that mistakes are okay and a necessary part of learning. Celebrate those mistakes. When I coach a women's intramural team at the University of Toronto Scarborough. It's my favorite. I coach girls that are either learning to play soccer for the first time, haven't played in a while, or just looking for more recreational opportunity to play. And I actually hate it when we win every game in the season, which sounds ironic. I think for some people winning is the end all be all, but I dislike it because it doesn't oftentimes give them an opportunity to learn. And so when we lose a game, as hard as it is for my athletes, I still bring them together and think about what can we do better? And even in winning, you're always able to improve upon and learn from some little minor mistakes. But for me, I'm able to say, okay, that's okay. We're going to pick ourselves up. What do we need to do better? What can we work at practice? So again, giving the opportunity to hear their input, but then acknowledging that, hey, we made a mistake and we're just going to learn. We're going to figure out how we can improve and do better, whether it's practice after practice, game after game, month after month, year after year. And still acknowledging that even in making mistakes, there's progress that has been made. So maybe they make a mistake, but they did something a little better, a little faster. Let's acknowledge and celebrate the even the smallest things that can go such a long way. Giving those high fives. Obviously now we're not able to give those high fives. Maybe those like air high fives or screen high fives, whatever works best. And then positive coaching. So contrary to popular belief, positive coaching is not criticism or competition avoidance. Coaches show they care about their participants by listening to them and coaching with patience and encouragement. Positive coaching also means empowering the teams and participants by making them feel like they belong and prioritizing social connection within the group. And again, as a coach, it's really that you are a role model. So you want to lead by example. Again, personally for me, I've run programs where one of the things that was the greatest joys and successes of running the program is seeing the girls warm up to me and being able to call me by name. That's so minor, but recognizing that I saw in the first 3 sessions, they didn't want to call me by name. By the 4th session, they're calling me Gabby, Coach Gabby. They're excited, they feel included, and knowing that I have a huge role in playing that, in creating that environment, and being able to support the girls and understand, if there's something that's not me creating the environment. For example, if it's a girl to girl opportunity where maybe we see one of the girls that might be more negative, it is within my control to go and speak to that girl and figure out what's wrong and how can we work this out to continue creating that positive environment for everyone. Also making new friends, like that's a huge one. I think for us too right now, especially during COVID, is being able to either maintain connections through Zoom or potentially create new ones, and that opportunity to socialize. That's something that's very much within our realm of how we can create that opportunity. And again, create the environment for the girls to thrive in and feel like they're able to build relationships. So leaders must include participants' voices, teach with patience and encouragement, and lead by example. So then lastly, we're going to talk about injury prevention. So girls and women are at a greater risk of experiencing certain injuries while being physically active. So having a knowledge of these injuries and what causes them will allow you to be better prepared against them. So depending on the nature of the injury, some may require you to educate both your participants and their parents. There's an incredible e-module called Keeping Girls in Sport. It's full of valuable information on this topic, and a link to the resource will be shared at the end of the workshop. It's something that I highly encourage, and at work with Fast and Female, we make sure that every single one of our role models and staff actually take the Keeping Girls in Sport module before attending any of our events. So we can look at here the different types of injuries. We have mechanical injury, which is often the result of accidents, sudden impact, overuse, or poor technical execution. Energetic injury, so injuries caused by consistent insufficient energy intake. And then psychosocial injury, so emotional injury as a result of a participant not being accepted, welcome, or given opportunities. And all of these can have a very lasting impact on the girls, which could lead to them dropping out and no longer participating in sport and recreational activities. So we want to make sure we're prepared. So taking preventative measures. Across the 3 different types of injuries, there are preventative measures that you can take to ensure girls have a safe sporting experience and recreational experience. So for example, for a mechanical injury, teaching the fundamental movement skills will allow girls to have the foundation and strength to learn more complex movements and skills, which minimize the risk of injury. So really taking the time, if you're teaching a drill or an activity, is you want to be able to, one, lead by example, show it to the girls, be able to, if you can, have multiple supporting facilitators or other coaches to support any of your participants as they're learning the skills, see how they can improve on them, talk to them and help them out. The other thing is education with both participants and parents and guardians about energetic injuries is a great preventative measure. So you can reinforce this by discussing how to fuel and make good food choices to be able to perform and stay active. And maybe it's not something that you're able to cover in your program, but are there resources that you can send or share with your parents or participants to be able to take home? We do also have to acknowledge that, again, taking an intersectional approach is we're not aware of what life is like back home for the participants and what they have access to. So being able to be cognizant of what you are encouraging and what is accessible, if that makes sense. And also happy to talk further about this afterwards. And then lastly, let your team know what to look out for in terms of social isolation and taking proactive steps to maintain a positive group dynamic. I do find that this is very difficult during COVID right now, because we have, especially during video, we use Zoom for a lot of our programs, is participants have the opportunity to not be on camera, mute themselves, and maybe just participate in the chat or not. So if there's opportunities to reach out to participants, whether it's through the chat, like just messaging them directly, It's being able to keep an eye out, and that's where it may be more beneficial to ensure that there's more than one person per Zoom call, monitoring who's engaging and who's not. Although for some participants, it may just be that they're not comfortable being on camera or just exhausted from being on camera as well. Okay, and so we are reaching the end of our workshop. So the last little bit, what we really want to focus on is a reflection piece for you all. So on this slide, you can see some of the key actions you are now able to take in order to advance the sport and physical activity sector into a more equitable and inclusive space. These actions include identifying the subtle and unsubtle barriers that exist for girls in sport and physical activity. So again, being aware of intersectionality and taking a gender plus approach. Being able to being able to recognize society's role in this and the way we unconsciously perpetuate these ideas. Language that's used, what's being shown, role models, visibility, representation. Being able to advocate for equity, and then taking the steps to keep girls in sport and recreation. So really being able to be intentional. Are you creating and promoting pathways for them to stay in physical activity? Being aware of what level you offer these programs, what age, is there a point where programs will stop and that there's nothing further for the girls to participate in, just being cognizant of it. And again, I mentioned this earlier, unfortunately we can't solve the world's problems, especially in the sport and recreation system during this 1 hour plus. But as you're aware of it, think about what are solutions of what you can do. And are there also opportunities to collaborate and partner with others to work together in this, where they can maybe fill any gaps or voids that you may have. So with that in mind, we do want to hear from you. We are committed to ongoing improvement of our programs and would very much value your feedback. We're going to have an opportunity for questions in a second, but this is a QR code to our survey. You'll also see a link in the chat in a few seconds to the post-workshop evaluation as well. So please take the time to complete this, whether you want to do this now or afterwards. It's roughly 3 minutes long and will provide us with valuable feedback on your experience. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Vanessa.
Hey everybody. So I've been a little bit aggressive in the chat. So there's a lot of info there, but I've most recently added the post-workshop evaluation. Like Gabby said, this is really valuable to us. We read what you say and we incorporate it into the next iteration of the workshop so it can benefit the next group of people who get to experience it. Before we move on to the Q&A, I'll just take a second to plug, Gabby, if you want to go to the next slide. So as mentioned in CJ's video and I spoke to at the top of the workshop, CPRA has funding right now that is available for application. Groups can receive up to $15,000 in grants to address barriers in sport participation. The application is open for a little over a week now, so about a week and a half, open until December 11th, and I will share a link to that in the chat. But really anything you can think of, funding to go towards any of the examples that Gabby shared that increase retention and the quality of participation in rec sport for girls and gender plus. So check that out if you haven't already. There'll be a link in the chat shortly. I think we have one slide left before questions, and that's just to thank you. So thank you all for participating and being here today. Thank you to CPRA, who was a huge support and huge, great partner in the development of this workshop, and then also Sport Canada, who funded this initiative. So with that, I think we can move on to Q&A. There's a couple of questions here, but if anybody has a question that they haven't posted, please take this opportunity to do so.
So thank you, Vanessa. I think we're going to have you and Gabby on screen now to answer some of the questions I've been monitoring. I was listing my own as well in case, but we don't need my questions because there's been some great questions that have come in from the delegates. So the first one, and you can choose, I think Rick had asked, Gabby, you mentioned briefly about obstacles for girls to participate. if they feel that they need to be or act a certain way. Has a survey ever been done to answer this question? I know you talked about a number of resources, and Vanessa was so kind to share some of those pieces. Others?
I'll provide a bit of input, and then Vanessa, let me know if you want to fill any of the gaps there. I'm not aware of an exact survey. Thank you for the question, first of all. I have read a lot of literature around the fear of girls participating in sport for the fear of being labeled as being a boy or being labeled as being a lesbian, which is obviously very detrimental in so many ways. It's detrimental in that there's a negative connotation in being a part of the LGBTQ plus community, which is not at all what it should be. But it does kind of speak back to what I had said earlier about the fact that sport was built on very much a male foundation. And so a lot of that historical knowledge and ideologies have been passed down through generations. It's actually crazy to see, if anyone ever has an opportunity, even to just look up some of the history of sport, is how recent some of the changes were in being able to have sport opportunities and participation for girls. I'm a U of T student. I did my undergrad there. I'm doing my master's there. I read up on the history, and knowing that it was even like in the 80s and 90s where women were not allowed to participate in some of the sporting opportunities. So a lot of that has still transferred into what's happening today. I think that's really where that comes from. I think it's also that idea sometimes that for girls is that there is an expectation to act a lot more feminine and be a lot more feminine in what those stereotypes are. And I think that's really often continuously reproduced by what the media puts out there, what we see in TV and magazines and social media. And so they feel like that they have to be more like that to live into being a girl, or in the expectation of being a girl, and that sport may take away from that, where that's not the case at all. Is you can be absolutely a sport and recreation enthusiast, be a fitness person, be athletic, and still be feminine if that's what you choose to do. But I'm not aware of any specific surveys that have been done. I don't know, Vanessa, if you've seen anything, and if you have, then I apologize for not being aware.
I can't think of specific research off the top of my head, but I do know that there was some done in comparison to sort of different genres, isn't the right word, but types of sports. So if you're thinking about an aesthetic sport like gymnastics or artistic swimming, or that type of performance versus what would be termed as like a more physical sport like rugby, or to take that kind of even further, a hunting sport like archery. And it was really interesting because I was speaking with someone from Archery Canada recently, and it just really sort of underlined the significance of role models and people who break these stereotypes, because there was a huge push for girls participating following the Hunger Games. But then the issue in the Canadian archery sport system, which is very young, to be fair, so there are some structures there that aren't in place. They didn't have those environments just yet that were really accepting of girls. They were accepting, but there were these underlying issues, and there was such an influx that they weren't able to support it. And so that blip, it kind of went up and then it went back down again, because if a girl showed up to an archery club in her community and there were, fewer than 3 girls in the program, she wasn't likely to come back in 2 weeks' time. And there weren't necessarily the role models there to be able to guide her. So like Gabby said, I can't think of research specifically, but it's something that I can look into and provide in the follow-up email for this workshop.
Awesome, thank you. And another question has come in to the Q&A. Heather has asked, and it pertains to what we're talking about, what we're looking at right now. Do you have any simple ideas for language that can be used to best address the public who may not have information or knowledge about this topic when they ask our frontline about why is this only a girls only program? Why is there not a boys only program? What does that look like, and what are your thoughts?
I could start. I'm sorry, this isn't funny. I just have to laugh because I used to work at our athletic facility at the U of T Scarborough campus, and this came up all the time when it came about our women's hours, women's only hours in the fitness, is that there would be a lot of males that would come in and say, or just individuals, like why only women's only, why not men's only? There are there is an issue across the board, as we've acknowledged, to participation in sport and physical activity and recreation from Canadians of all gender identities, of all walks of life, of all ages, of all racial and ethnic identities. But we do need to acknowledge that there are a lot more considerations and barriers when it comes to being a young girl or woman, or just a girl or woman in general. And again, taking an intersectional approach, that those barriers are multiplied and have added layers of consideration and marginalization when it comes to being, for example, a young girl of color, a young Muslim girl. So there's like the snipey, like Starkey answer of like, well, everything else is made for boys and males. But I think it ultimately, Heather, it is a longer conversation. I don't think it can be summarized quickly. I think it's acknowledging that there are added barriers and considerations, and that there is more to learn, and that here's a resource that you can learn more about what girls' experiences are. But I think as simple as just being like, the way we would handle it is, thanks for your feedback and your questions and considerations. We have heard from our population, and we have seen through research and multiple reports and programmings. Like, let's get real. If you turn on the TV right now, you're more likely to see men's sports than you are to see women's sports. And you're going to see that in almost every aspect of sport and recreation, unless you walk into a women's only or girls only area, is that you're going to see more representation from the men. So we're trying to take an equitable approach, right? We want to give that equitable approach of giving girls and women the opportunity to have a safe and inclusive environment, because of how many other things we have to consider and what their barriers to participation are. I don't think that was the short answer by any means, but I'll pass it to Vanessa to see if she wants to add anything there.
Yeah, I think that everything that Gabby said was true, and we've all experienced it. So I think this is a really wonderful question. You kind of have to assume that there is a baseline there when you enter this conversation. Otherwise, like Gabby said, you gotta start here, and it's a really long conversation. What I might suggest, because this often takes place in specific sport spaces, like a front desk, or where the turnstiles are, maybe where someone's trying to enter and then they're unable to. I would just go equity versus equality. And if you're able to, pull that graphic from this workshop, it's one that we've, purchased and put with our own colors of purple and blue, but you can see that bike metaphor as soon as you put it into Google Images. And I would just have like a little sign there so people can look at the metaphor and absorb it themselves. And then you can find your own language around it. I think it's practiced, and you have to become a little bit finesse about it, so as not to create conflict each time you enter this conversation. But if you have posters or other visual cues that really represent the culture of your space, and that you offer services for equity seeking groups, like Gabby said, then eventually people get on board and they understand, and that's how you build a community that's inclusive of everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. So next question, I feel like I just have a million here, but I think they're delightful questions. So Larissa's asked, we've discussed how to keep girls in sport, but how do you engage them in sport to start? So how do you get them started? Or how do you re-engage them after some time away?
I can get it going, Gabby. So the first few things that come to mind for engaging girls who haven't necessarily been active is, consult. So what other spaces in your community do you find girls? Is there an art program or a music program or a drama program? Can you go to the schools and start to set something up and have these try-it events where you're playing volleyball for the first time, and everybody's playing volleyball for the first time, so they're on an even playing field and there's no egos. And then you're including all of those fun social connecting games like Gabby mentioned to make sure that people feel safe with each other. So I would start by, finding out where are the girls and go there and bring sport and recreation to them. And then once you have that hook, they start joining your community, and then you ensure that you have those infrastructures to keep them. So you have the social connectors, you have the positive role models, etc.
I completely agree with Vanessa. one of the things that just really got me so excited about being a young adult in school was the opportunity to keep playing sport. Because I think there's also this mindset with sport and recreation that if you don't start at a younger age, that there's no point in starting like later on in life, that the idea that to be able to be good at something, you have to start when you're 3 or 4. Like I didn't start playing soccer until I was 11. Not that I'm anywhere close to being like a professional, very much so a recreational player. But I thought that when I left high school, that was it. I hesitated to even try out for the intramural team at the university. And it wasn't until I understood that there was different entry points and opportunities for me to be involved in the sport that encouraged me to continue with it. And I think that's so important. Is also, thank you for this question, because one of my things is I think it's so important for us to focus on when girls drop out of sport. But if there's nothing for them after they've dropped out to re-engage, then you've completely lost them. So if they're dropping out between the ages of 8 to 14 and then they're 15 and you don't have an opportunity to re-engage them, if you don't have an opportunity to, even let them know that this exists and that it's okay to still like be a part of it, you've lost them entirely. And so I think that also goes for girls over the age of 15 and also just women in general. I think being able to really think about, and I mentioned this earlier, is look at your programming opportunities. Do you have something there for the different age groups, and do you have the different entry points? I also will say that I am very aware, especially in Toronto, as I've seen a lot of sport leagues that are folding, that don't have women's programming anymore because they saw low registration. And they just got rid of the program. You need to also question why. What is it? So to Vanessa's point is consult, ask, why are people not participating? Are there too many programs? Are they competing? What is the barrier to accessing it? And is there something that we could do to make it a better opportunity? I swear to you, every soccer league in Toronto in like last year and the year beforehand, women's soccer was on the same day. It was Sunday morning. Sunday morning didn't work for me. So then if you're telling me that all 4 women's leagues in the city only have soccer on Sunday morning, then I'm just going to have to go create my own league, or I stop playing sport at this point. So I think that's a really valuable thing. There is a lot of added steps in that. And I kind of apologize for the world for that. But I think if you don't take a look and kind of survey what's already out there or what the barrier might be, or ask your participants, you may end up in that position where you've now allocated times and funds for a program that isn't going to work because you didn't actually take a moment to consult and figure out if it would work for your targeted demographic.
Great. Wow. My head is still spinning. So that was some great information around that question. And we talked about, what we would do, how we would do it. And Marian had posted something in the chat as well about kids sport programs, offering try it programs in different communities as well. So kind of the same way, Gabby, you talked during your presentation about consult, and listening to what your community members were saying, and listening in those partnerships and building supportive environments. Georgia asks here, she says she's finishing her undergrad in sports management and would like to pursue a career focused on women's leisure. What would you recommend for me to get involved in this area? And I know Vanessa shared a great amount of resources as you were talking, and I was clicking on them all, but are there other pieces, that you would suggest?
I mean, selfishly, Georgia, I want to tell you to sign up as a role model for Fast and Female. But I'd say this is the thing for me too, is when I was in my undergrad and I thought to myself, this is the career path I want to go into, I wanted to make sure that it really was. So I looked for every single volunteer opportunity, every resource I could read up on. Like I wanted to try to find as much as possible. And I think that's so important. It was in my undergrad that I discovered Canadian Women in Sport, formerly known as CAUSE, was so excited to learn about them. It's, as I started playing soccer, I then decided I wanted to coach. And I'm not telling you that don't do anything you don't want to do. I think that's also the very important thing. But I think trying to just familiarize yourself with it and then find a way to like dip your toes in the field to see if it's something that you could really enjoy. Coaching, and Vanessa and I can definitely speak about this. We used to coach together. I know Vanessa still does at the MLSE Launchpad in Toronto. And if you have the opportunity to get involved in coaching or volunteering or programming, in women's leisure, in some capacity, and see, what you notice, what you feel, do you enjoy it? In what aspect do you want to support it? it really makes a difference in clarity in how you want to be able to contribute to the field and make a difference in whatever way you want to. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
I would have loved to have heard Gabby's answer like 7 years ago when I had no idea what I was doing, but along the same lines. I was in university, I was playing basketball. I knew I didn't have the skills to like have a career overseas. And I thought the only other opportunity for me to work in sport was to coach, which I wasn't at the time, I wasn't really enjoying because I was on the high performance side and I wasn't getting enough out of it. Like mentally. And so I did a number of other things that, were transferable skills that led me to here. But exactly like Gabby said, volunteer. There's tons because, sport is tied to live events and being around people. There's tons of opportunities to volunteer in a number of capacities. I joined a sport organization's, one of their fundraising committees because I thought that's what I was interested in. And it was free 2 months, 2 or 3 meetings before I was like, this is not for me. I'm not enjoying this at all. And I considered doing a post-grad in fundraising, and that could have used up a year of my life and a year of tuition. But I volunteered in the sector I wanted to work in to learn right away. I was like, no, not for me. So, the best advice that I got was just hustling for those opportunities that other people aren't willing to do. So it's maybe getting up at an hour that's way too early to go across the city and volunteer as a ref, and then you meet someone and it's such a social environment that if you're putting in that effort, the opportunities can become available.
Great. Thank you. I love that you're saying this, right? As a teacher, these are things that I say to my students all the time. They're hearing it from someone else. I love it. So a question from Paul, and I think this is going to be our last question as we wrap up. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to them all. And we may have answered, so it may be quick and we may be able to get on to another one. But Paul says, a lot of the discussion focused around engaging the girls, but have there been strategies to engage parents and work to break down the stereotypes and barriers in parents' minds around females in sport?
I can start. I think there are a lot of resources. I think there's also a lot of the resources that Canadian Women in Sport has is definitely applicable to parents as well. And Vanessa, I'll definitely let you speak to this more, but I know there's a new initiative of your role. There's also other organizations out there that really can support parents. Active for Life is a really great one that I would really recommend. But it is hard. And what I will say is I've been fortunate to work. I run a girls program and I still kind of do in partnership with the Boys and Girls Club. And we always talk about how parent education is so important because when I talk to the girls, a lot of times the reasons why they don't participate in sport and physical activity is because of parents' perception of sport. And I've seen this even in coaching at the university. I've coached an athlete who told me my parents don't know that I'm here. They think I'm studying. And we're talking about a young woman who's 20, 21, and who didn't tell her parents until she won that she had been involved on the team because that's when it was valuable. I think the tough thing is that it can only go so far. And that's really like sad to say, but it's the truth. But I think there's definitely resources out there. Thank you, Vanessa. Vanessa's popped into the chat, your role as parent or guardians, but definitely start with Canadian Women's Sport. Active for Life is another one. Fast and Female, we sometimes will run parents and coaches seminar. We actually just did one this morning as part of our summit, but there's definitely things out there. And especially now in the virtual world, I mean, I don't know if anyone else is with me here, but I sign up for like every webinar possible. 95% of the time I don't end up making it and just watch the recording afterwards, but taking advantage of what's out there right now because obviously acknowledging that COVID has impacted people in so many different ways. But the thing about things, the benefit of things going online is they're so much more accessible instead of having the barrier of geographical location. And so I would keep your eye out right now on what's around, but definitely what Vanessa popped in the chat is a great place to start.
Awesome. That's great. I love that answer as well. And thank you, Vanessa, for populating more information there as well. So thank you to both of you. I think we're going to wrap up and kind of do the last couple of slides that we need to do. Thank you. I'm a firm believer in terms of the influences on girls' participation. And they've always been important to me as a mom, a coach, an athlete, a teacher, an ally, whatever we want to call it. But through and through, the information that you shared with us today has been amazing. I love it. I love that you're encouraging us to continue to learn, whether it's reading a resource or registering for a webinar. So thank you for that. And thank you, as Karen says, for empowering women of all ages and backgrounds today in what you spoke to us about. So thank you for that.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, no problem. So Vanessa has shared a number of resources throughout today's session. There are a couple of more that we wanted to share with you as well. So PRO's COVID-19 resource page, High Five PHCD online training, and as mentioned in the intro video, the CPRA national database, the bench, cpra.ca. A reminder about our upcoming sessions. So tomorrow, a session, Synthetics Turf Sport Fields Essentials, and then our closing keynote on December the 9th with the 5 pillars of diversity and inclusion. Thank you to our title sponsor, Perfect Mind. Stay safe and be kind.
And thank you, Michelle. Thank you to Gabby. Thank you to Vanessa. It's been a great event, and we'll see you hopefully tomorrow. Bye now.